We got books to talk about. Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you could join me. I'm Cam, and this is The Corner. So, before we get into the books and my thoughts on them, I want to do a quick review of my rating system. I'm going to be using a 5-star rating system. It's what most people are familiar with. It's what a lot of websites and apps use when they're trying to give you a good, an average rating of what other people thought. It's typically a 5-star thing. However, I'm going to be doing partial stars, so 3-star, 3.25, 3.5, 3.75, those kinds of things. They're variable. It's really how I enjoyed the book, and obviously that's what most people are going to be doing with their rating. Did I like it or did I not? What I factor in when I decide if I like a book is, one, literally, did I enjoy reading it? Was it pleasurable to read, or was I slogging through it? 2, did something in it grip me? Am I still thinking about that book days later, weeks later, months later, years later? A lot of us have a book or a few books that we are thinking about for years and years and years, and that's a sign of a great book. So that factors in for me. Also, did I learn something from it? Whether it's a fiction or whether it's a nonfiction, did I learn something about myself? Did I learn something about history? Did I learn something about psychology, the way that the human mind works? Did I learn something about geography or language or culture? A book doesn't have to be educational per se, but I find that I enjoy a book more if I feel like I took something with me when I've finished it. That doesn't always have to factor in, and it's not going to drop anything by a star or anything if it wasn't something that, gave me an educational experience. But I think a book can give you something to take with you, even if it didn't necessarily set out to do that exact thing. So those are really the biggest factors to me when I've read it. There are going to be books that have very low ratings for me that I didn't enjoy, but I can still be glad that I read them. I'll probably talk about this in other videos, but I'm sure that there are books that you had to read in school maybe, or for projects, and you didn't like them, but in the end, you know what? You can say I've read them. And there is a quote from Mark Twain that is, "A classic is something everyone wants to have read, but no one wants to read." You'll probably see from my giant stack of books over here, I read a lot of classics, and I've always read a lot of classics. I was the weird girl in 4th grade reading Moby Dick at recess because I wanted to. So I tend towards classics. I'm not sure why, honestly. There are some classics I absolutely hated. There are some classics that I loved. There are a lot that are just, they're okay, they're fine. But that tends to be a lot of what I'm drawn to. Today, there's mostly classics. There are a few more contemporary stories in here, as you'll see. But just kind of know that is where I tend to get maybe at least 50%, if not maybe 60 or 70% of my choices in reading material. So with that said, my star rating explained, my kind of taste in literature explained, let's get into it. Okay, so I'm gonna drop them. All right, these are the books. Here's how we're gonna split this up. I have collected everything I've read from March, April, and May of 2022. Because that's kind of when I started reading again for pleasure, really diving in and being able to pick and spend my personal time, spend my alone time how I wanted to, which is with a book. So we're gonna go through first March, then we're gonna go through April. I'll see if I have to clip the video there because it's at least half of this pile. So we'll see how far we can get. So our first book is Invitation to a Beheading, Vladimir Nabokov. Classic book, classic author. Many people have read this. If you haven't read this, I'm going to read a little bit of the blurb on the back, and I'll tell you why I'm only going to read a little bit. Like Kafka's The Castle, Invitation to a Beheading embodies a vision of a bizarre and irrational world. In an unnamed dream country, the young man, Cincinnatus C., is condemned to death by beheading for Gnostical turpitude. an imaginary crime that defies definition. Okay, so that's where I'm gonna stop, even though it continues on with some of the explanation. And the reason that I'm gonna stop is because the next sentence contains a spoiler to this book. Why would you do that? Why would you put spoilers on the blurb on the back? Like, I don't understand that. And I will say that actually knocked down my rating for this a little bit because, and it's not the book's fault, it's not the author's fault, the author didn't write the blurb, but it did diminish my enjoyment of it in that there was a character in here that I knew who the character was, I knew what his purpose was, I knew what was gonna happen with that character. And so that little bit of surprise that I might have had was gone, and that really bothered me. In general though, it's not a great book for me. I ended up actually rating this only 3 stars. If you look on Goodreads, a lot of people are at more like the 4-star, a lot of people are at 5-star. They think this is an absolute masterpiece. And you know what? It might be. I just may not like masterpieces, at least not this one. And that's fine. That is absolutely, absolutely fine. For me, the reason that this didn't stick that 5 is because it was this kind of fever dream, crazy, almost alternate reality in a way. It was hard to follow, and it's not a bad thing that you write a book about a fever dream. I actually have another one in this pile that was definitely not a similar story, but a similar weirdness to it. That one was much easier to follow, even though none of it made sense. And until you read it and until you decide for yourself whether it makes sense or not, it's really, really hard to describe. But for me, I didn't find it super enjoyable. However, I will say for this, the ending did it justice. I feel like this book got where I wanted it to go, even though while I was reading it, I didn't know that's where I wanted it to go. Does that make sense? Probably not. But it was a satisfying ending because it was, in a way, it was just as weird and nothing was truly explained. But the end resolution was satisfying. It was a hopeful kind of commentary on the desolation, the hopelessness of the rest of the book. So hopefully that's not spoilers for anybody. I hope I didn't just spoil it like the blurb on the back. But I will say, if you're gonna pick this up, I do recommend don't read the back too much, especially, at least not for this edition, which is the, what is this? It just says Vintage Edition, Vintage International. Don't read the blurb on the back from the Vintage International books. If you want to read this, I would still say it's a good recommend. I think a 3-star is a really solid book. I think it's a really good rating. I think anything below a 3-star, you're getting into kind of dicey territory, but I would say if you're interested, pick it up, give it a chance, give it a shot for yourself. So the next one on our list, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This may shock a lot of people when I say this is the first time I've read this book, and this is also the first Jane Austen I have ever read. No, I will not tell you how old I am. So I am going to tell you a little story though about why it has taken me so long to read what is, to be fair, an absolutely gorgeous book. So in, gosh, either middle school or high school, I want to say it's probably high school, my best friend at the time, who was an absolutely voracious reader as well, loved Jane Austen, and specifically, she absolutely loved Pride and Prejudice. She tried for a very long time to get me to read it. I wanted nothing to do with it. She tried to get me to watch the movie when it came out. I also wanted even less to do with that. I had this idea that romance books, especially classic romance novels, would be so incredibly boring. I think I have always been a plot-driven kind of reader versus a character-driven, and yet when I read character-driven books, I love them. I find them very deeply moving a lot of times. So I'm not sure why I would describe myself primarily as a plot-based person, but romance in particular has always just I don't know, I've never felt a desire to read them. And I think partly, at least in part, it's because to me, the idea that you're gonna have a book that is simply about two people trying to get together or trying to hate each other and then falling in love at the end it's not enough to make a good book. That's always the idea that I had. And I also kind of felt, without ever having picked up any of these types of books, that the writing, the dialogue, the way of speaking would be very old school and would be just horrible to try to get through. I'm not exactly sure, again, why I thought that either. But that's a huge part of why I ignored and avoided these books for a very long time. And my poor friend, she really, really tried. She would tell me how witty the banter was and how clever the characters were, and just the language in it really, really drew her in. And that poor girl had no idea that it was just pushing me further and further away, because none of that sounded interesting to me. So after a very long time of not really reading for pleasure, I went through about 10 or 12 years of just book burnout, and it was not the fault of books, it was just my life. I got very busy with a new job 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It just sort of sucked my very soul out of me in a way. And one of the things that just got pushed to the side was reading. I just didn't have the time or the energy for that type of diversion. And it was really the booktube community and watching some of the content creators just gush about their books and talk about how much they loved what they've been reading. And so many of them have discovered books that I had read over the years, and it just kind of reignited that desire of mine to dig in and read like I used to read. So I went to the bookstore and I was gonna stock up on a few books and I was gonna just dive in again. And I went looking for a book next to this one. I definitely did not go for Pride and Prejudice. However, I did get drawn in by this cover because I'm a sucker for a good cover, and this thing is beautiful. And I went, okay, fine, I'll do it. I swore I would never read Jane Austen, I would never read Charlotte Bronte, I would never read Emily Bronte, I would never read Virginia Woolf. Still haven't read Virginia Woolf. Maybe I'll get there. But I got over myself a little bit and I read this book. Guys, I gave it 5 stars. I am embarrassed. I am embarrassed that it took me this long to read this book. One, that it took me so long to give a book a chance, to give an author a chance. Very close-minded of me. I'm definitely going to admit to that. Absolutely. I was prejudiced. And frankly, I was too proud to admit it. It actually makes me think of the scene in, a little cat hair. It makes me think of the scene in You've Got Mail with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan when she convinces him to read it. And that always resonated with me because I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to be Tom Hanks in this movie. And he reads it and he just kind of doesn't get it. But then in the end, he kind of falls in love with it. And that, is kind of a little bit of that spark of connection between them. And I was like, Tom, you fell for it. Well, Tom, it's you and me, buddy. And it's Jane Austen, and it's all good. Okay, what I really liked about this was the character development and the character depth. These characters knew who they were. These characters were not molded by the people that they encountered. And I really, really liked that. Also, these were real people. They responded and behaved and spoke like real people. And when something happened, they reacted like an actual human being would react, and I was very, very surprised, and I really, really appreciated that about this book. And lastly, I will say that I was very happy that none of the romance tropes that I expected to see in here were in here. You sort of expect there's a few. There's enemies to lovers, there's love at first sight, but a lot of romance stories will end up having, they get into it, they get into a relationship, they're the ones for each other, and then a misunderstanding happens or a conflict happens, you know, and it goes in the 3-part chapter arcs, there's the 3-part story arcs, and it's so predictable. And this had none of that. Was it an enemies to lovers? Kind of, barely, honestly. But it actually progressed so naturally, and I just really, really appreciated the writing and the characters. The language in here is not old-timey English that I can't understand and I can't follow. It felt very modern, and it felt very timeless. The story, the characters, and the way that things progress felt just as relevant today, despite being written when it was written so long ago. And I would highly recommend that if you're interested, check out this book. And also, if you can, get this cover because it's so pretty. It's so pretty. I love book covers, what can I say? Okay, so honestly, that was it for March. I got 2 books in. I started kind of late, so that's fine. I'm okay with that. I did try to read a 3rd book though, and I don't know if I always want to talk about books that I DNF, but I will this time at least, because it was the first part of my reading for March, and it's partly why I didn't get very far in anything else. So I am going to talk about the 1 book that I DNF'd, and I will put the artwork here, or maybe over here. Somewhere here you will start to see some artwork. And that was, the book itself was by Haruki Murakami, and it was 1Q84. I have heard so much about this author, and I really, really wanted to read him, but I really was expecting to enjoy it thoroughly. I was expecting to absolutely love it. So I don't know if I went in with too high of an expectation or what, but this story just did not do it for me. The story itself seemed interesting enough, but I got like a 1/3 of the way through the book and nothing had happened. And I thought, okay, maybe this is a slow burn. But there were, as I was going through it, and it wasn't just that nothing had happened, a few things were starting to bother me about the writing. And part of what was bothering me was this repetition of certain things, certain items, certain dialogues that kept getting repeated, but it felt like it didn't have a purpose. I understand repetition and the need for it sometimes, the value in it, but in this instance, I personally didn't get it. It didn't click with me. It just felt like it was going over the same thing and going over the same thing and going over the same thing, even in little snippets, but it was too much and too repetitive for what I could see no value in. I kind of sneaked onto Goodreads and I started reading some reviews because I thought, am I crazy? Am I the only one who's thinking this? Like, am I just not getting something? Maybe somebody will have some insight for me. And the reviews that resonated with me the most were the ones that were kind of saying the same thing, where other people had that same impression that I did. Other people had that same frustrations of it's not going anywhere and it's not doing anything and it's not repeating for any good reason. The other big issue that I had with it, and this is actually what made me stop reading. I could have put up with the rest of it, but I didn't care for how some of the subject matter was being handled and the people that subject matter was about. And I'm not going to get into it because I would say it's probably very spoilery, but you can talk about difficult themes, you can talk about horrible themes, you can talk about trauma, you can talk about, you can have characters that are just not good people, but they can serve a purpose. They can enhance your story, and the reader doesn't even have to like them. The point of them can be for the reader to dislike, and that's fine. Great stories are made that way. What really bothered me, honestly though, was in this book, it felt like the author wanted you to either like them or feel neutral about them, or to feel negatively about something that I don't feel is right to feel negatively about. Again, I know this is being very vague, but with something like this book, I think getting into it too much is, I think it's just too spoilery. And I think this, you know, a lot of times books are a very personal thing. So for people who really, really loved this book, I don't understand why exactly, but clearly something in it resonated with them, and I'm definitely not going to knock that. I'm not going to invalidate anybody's opinions about this book. I definitely want to try something else by this author though. From what I've seen, maybe the Wind Up Bird Chronicles, or I think it's called Late Night in Tokyo. You know, something else maybe is gonna hit me, and I'm very excited to try to find something else that I've heard. And I haven't actually seen anybody else talk about this book. I've only seen it on Goodreads, and it was in some of my book recommendations on, I believe it's BookBub. And that's where I picked it up, and I only have the e-copy, so that's why you don't have a physical prop in my hands, and I'm feeling so awkward for that. Thank you so much for joining me for my wrap up for March. I know it wasn't many books, but I am just getting my feet wet in this whole YouTube, BookTube community, and I don't want to have a first video that's like an hour and a half long trying to cram 3 months worth of books into it. So I'm gonna end it here. This is my wrap up for March. I had 2 finished books, Vladimir Nabokov's Invitation to Beheading at 3 stars, and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice at 5 stars, and my 1 TNF, 1 QA4. I will hopefully see you again soon. I will be making my April video immediately after this, and then I will be making my May video immediately after that, and I'll be publishing them all hopefully around the same time, but I won't have any costume changes, so what you see is what you get for today. Thank you again so much for joining me in my little corner and talking about books with me, and I hope to see you soon.